Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people, the traditional custodians of this place, Barangaroo Reserve, where we meet today. I acknowledge elders past and present and thank them for the contribution to this landscape. I would also like to acknowledge that Aboriginal sovereignty has not been ceded. Welcome to the International Festival of Landscape Architecture, or Land-e-scape, this year, 2020. My name is Sara Padgett Kjaersgaard. I'm a registered landscape architect, fellow of AILA and lecturer here at NSW Sydney. Today, I'll be chatting with Minister Rob Stokes. He's the Minister for Planning and Public Open Spaces in the New South Wales Government. We'll be covering a range of questions that have been fielded from our membership, including green infrastructure, policy, legislation, and how landscape architects can be more political. I look forward to bringing that conversation to you shortly. Minister Stokes, we've got about 3,500 landscape architecture members for the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects across the country. So could you explain to all of our members, those not familiar with New South Wales politics, what your role is as Minister for Planning and Public Open Space here?
Well, Sarah, I'm so excited actually to, as far as I know, to be the first ever Minister for Public Spaces anywhere in the world. Ethan Kent from the Project for Public Spaces mentioned that they'd done a review and found that as far as they knew, I was the very first person to have that title, which I'm very pleased that the Premier Gladys Berejiklian saw the need to provide a voice for the built environment as part of the planning portfolio. Planning obviously is about trying to guide sustainable development to make people's lives better, but adding on that element of public spaces recognises that the public realm and interface between private and public spaces is crucial in getting planning right.
Okay, so here's a tough question for you. What is your favourite designed landscape in Australia?
Sarah, it's a really tricky question because there are so many and it's difficult to choose. So I'll take the advantage of mentioning a few. I grew up next to a really famous old garden called Erraldine with a beautiful old home built by an architect called Hardy Wilson, and the garden was built by a fellow I remember, an ancient professor called Professor Waterhouse, who built this beautiful Asian-inspired garden over many decades. That was a beautiful place that's evokes strong memories for me, and that connection between place and your own identity that was sort of forged at that time. In my electorate, I represent the northern beaches of Sydney, a place called Pittwater, and there's a beautiful little pocket park right up the top of a saddle of a hill looking out over Barrenjoey Headland and out to the Tasman Sea, and it's called the Bible Garden, and it's a place where some people decided to plant every plant mentioned in the Bible. So it's this beautiful spot under some cedars of Lebanon, just a really beautiful place. And otherwise there's some of the great botanic gardens, and Sydney obviously is a beautiful botanic garden, but in one sense it's fortunate to have such an incredibly inspired location. Other botanic gardens have had to work a bit harder. So Melbourne, I think, is an incredible botanic garden because they've really had to put a lot of thought into the design. Also Hobart, I find that's a really special botanic garden for me, just a beautiful space. So there's a few to start with.
Yeah, and these public spaces have really come to light during the COVID pandemic. So too, I guess, has the profession of landscape architecture and the impact that landscape architects have on society. Have you found that? Have you found that landscape architects and the role that we have in contributing to society come to light a little bit more during the pandemic?
Absolutely. I can't stress that more. The role of landscape architects in our society now is more, it's always been important, but I think it's underscored now because over the past decade or so, the decade, there's been this debate over sort of digital public spaces and physical public spaces, but I think the COVID pandemic has emphasised the importance of those physical public spaces. It's funny that almost the human condition is when we can't have something that's what we want. Yes. So when we're told we can't socialise or we're locked into our local community, the very thing we want is spaces that allow us to socialise, and public spaces are those that allow us to do it safely.
Of course, of course. Now landscape architects need to become more political, and so what are some of the soft and hard skills that landscape architects can develop to help them influence legislation better?
I think where do you start there? I think I think this idea of monumentalism and legacy is really important. I think here at Stargazer Park makes a good case for that. It's associated with Paul Keating, for example, and was something that Mike Baird was able to deliver when he was Premier. And so there's almost a sense of tangible output that then becomes an outcome for society. So, hooking into that idea that we're creating legacies for people, that's a politically powerful
narrative, I guess.
Yeah, narrative, that's right. Yeah. But other skills, I think one of the challenges is so much of the focus in politics or in public discourse is things. So when we talk about the built environment, we focus on the buildings, not the spaces in between. Yeah. But when you conceptualise of these spaces, as if you will, the print on a page of paper, the print only makes sense because of the spaces in between. Yes. It doesn't make sense without the margin. So the margin is just as important as the printing. And some of the great advertisers have learnt that, sort of the Nike Just Do It. It's that just those 3 words, just a few letters on an otherwise blank piece of paper. So the margin emphasises what's written. So I think to think of landscape as that margin that's so important to give meaning to the built environment is another really powerful way of explaining the political importance of landscape. And remember, this is always, you look at the very first principles of urban design, the Greek city-state, for example, and what was at the centre of those? It was the marketplace and the theatre and the public spaces that linked them all together.
Yeah, I love that notion of the absent space, or the white space on the page, the green space of our cities. This idea of legacy as well is just really pulls at the heartstrings for all of us. I think about green and blue infrastructures, so there's interconnected green areas that are either green or blue, our rivers and our creeks, and we landscape architects really, really value these spaces, but you would have heard the negative arguments for why wouldn't we connect green spaces and blue spaces. Could you share with us some of those stories that we wouldn't want to hear about? Why don't we want to connect green and blue infrastructures?
I think it ultimately comes down to cost. People see what's the value, and so they want to know what the value proposition is. And it's an easy or lazy thing for people to say, oh, these things cost extra, and so why should they have to be provided? I think also there's this almost ideological debate about private and public spaces. Yeah. And so it's funny, there's a resistance to any sort of commercial activity on public spaces because that's seen as a commercialising, but equally to create public space out of private space is seen as taking value away. So I think debates about commercialisation distort the narrative on both sides, and where commercial activity can activate a space and provide more opportunity for the public to come in or to extract value from spaces, that can sometimes be a good thing. And I think sometimes ideological resistance to these ideas is not helpful. There's an urban geographer called Edward Soja who wrote a lot about this. And like the classic example is the shopping mall. It's a private space where the public are invited in. And so is it really a private space, and what role does the public have to control and own those spaces? But the same goes for a kiosk operating in a botanic garden, for example. If that can activate a space or make it safer for people, then that may not be such a bad thing.
And I guess one of the other complexities is about the temporal component of landscape. It takes decades for some of our great landscapes to really grow and interconnect. So it's not immediate. So is that part of the pushback as well, that it might not be something that the public can see immediately?
Yeah, I suppose I hadn't really reflected on that nature of things, but I think there's something, part of my political philosophy is that there's something about the human condition that we want to restore things. There's a restorative urge in us, and so you see the home renovation shows, or restoration home, or any of these things, or car restoration programs, or anything like that. Humans like to take something broken and fix it, and whether that's a relationship, whether it's a landscape. So there's something very, very powerful, and I think there's a political narrative to that. So I don't actually think the fact that it takes years for something to grow is a negative. I think that's actually more of a positive.
Excellent. We've got some questions that have come in from our members. So we're going to take a walk, and then I'm going to field some of those questions to you.
Thanks, Sara.
Thanks. Minister Stokes, we've done a bit of a walk and talk, and now I've sat you down and I'm going to give you some hardline questions from our members. The first question relates to your role as Minister for Planning and Public Open Space and the way that the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects can help you achieve your goals and you to reach success in this role. What can we do to help you?
Well, great ways we can work together. First, here in New South Wales, we're bringing all our design thinking in our planning law into the one place, a state environmental planning policy on design and place, and we're doing that work through the New South Wales Government Architect right now, and certainly through the New South Wales Government Architect's Office. That's sort of the, if you like, the controlling mind in relation to the government's thinking about design more broadly. So that office is really the great way in which sort of landscape architects can connect into the thinking of government.
So really taking that policy, implementing it on the ground, building great projects, and then feeding back and help promote the great work and interconnections between government and built projects on the ground.
Yeah, because so often, and my message often to developers and proponents is, I can help you get what you want to get done if you do a good job. So if the lived experience of urban change is that it improves local environments, then it makes my job easy. The challenge so often is that developments detract from the environment in which they are located. They're sort of almost parasitic. They take from the values but don't give anything back. So the real challenge is to make sure that what we do is so beautiful, so elegant, so well designed, so thoughtful and so granular in their environment that people want more of it.
And so your role as Minister for Public Open Spaces is a real privilege, and you mentioned to us earlier that it's probably the only role that exists in the world, or it is the only role that exists in the world. So do you think that our states and territories should mirror what the New South Wales government has done and have their own Minister of Public Open Spaces? And then second to that, should you all come together in National Cabinet and influence discussions around infrastructure, housing, environment and planning?
Yes, we certainly should. The lived experience here in New South Wales is it's changed the way that we think about development. So already I'm able to have conversations with proponents to say, well, if you want to get your projects accelerated through the planning system, demonstrate what the wider public benefits are and talk about it in the terms that an economist would use. Economists love to talk about interventions being on the basis of securing public goods, and public goods are things that are non-exclusive, non-rival, so good design and public spaces, fall directly within that definition of what the public good is, and so securing the public good should be all what planning systems are all about, and having that connection between public spaces, design thinking and planning outcomes is the best way to shape that narrative and that way of thinking. Often planning ministers in other jurisdictions are seen as development ministers, and of course it's development is a social good, provided of course it's good development, and that public spaces lens shapes the development in ways that are sustainable and actually make a place better. I think it was Edward Carr, the British historian, who said growth is inevitable, or change is inevitable rather, but progress is not. So it's about shifting that idea of change into change that actually meets the needs of our community, to make our cities that are fairer, more just, also cleaner and healthier.
And that idea also about urban density and urban densification, that's happening all across Australia and all of our metropolitan cities, particularly over the last decade. We've really come up hard against urban infill targets, and that's going to be ongoing as most of our cities, particularly Sydney and Melbourne, double their populations by 2050. And I guess one of the difficult things about how we interconnect metropolitan policy with kind of policy that happens at the ground. So if I think about the local street and the local lot, and as we get denser and denser and denser along a local street, we typically lose those green spaces. For example, some of the policies talk about, minimum soil depths, and that's difficult because then we can't actually grow trees that have great canopy cover. So my question to you, or from our members, is about how can we make sure those great ideals, those metropolitan policies like the Greener Places policy can actually land at the street and lot level and make a difference for greening our streets?
Well, I think the short answer is you're absolutely right to identify the challenge. Most cities in the world are moving from an urban model to a more suburban model. We're going the opposite way. We started with a suburban model and are becoming more urban. And so that creates different conflicts than in other areas. But the nature of our conflicts is the biggest single land use in any of our cities will continue to be open space. When you look at across any metropolitan area, the biggest single land use is effectively no formal use at all. So the densification will happen on private lands. So we need to think much more thoughtfully and consciously about how we use the sort of strangely, oddly named nature strip to actually make that a nature strip, and to think about that really consciously, but also about private open spaces as well. Obviously, we're going to have to be much more thoughtful about the design treatment of these spaces. The constraints, constraint is often the architect to great design, and so those constraints by themselves are not necessarily a bad thing because they require us to be more thoughtful. The way that we've developed it in the past, we haven't given much thought to our use of space because we've always had so much of it. So that's why the role of landscape architecture is going to become more and more important, because as our spaces become more and more constrained, we have to be much more thoughtful about the way in which we use them. Your point about deep soil plantings is a good one, and we've recently had a challenging discussion with the Housing Industry Association in this state and the Urban Development Institute in this state, because we've put in some new guidelines around developing new housing in a new town outside Sydney called Wilton. And here the DCP, or the Development Control Plan in New South Wales, is prescribing controls around ensuring that there is room for at least one mature tree in a detached lot. And in one sense, it was extraordinary. It had to have this debate. I would have thought it would be obvious that if you've got a backyard, you should be able to plant a tree in it. Yes. But we've, our planning rules had become so perverse in one sense that we allowed backyards to be built where you couldn't fit a tree in it, yes. Which it sort of strikes me as frankly absurd. And particularly as we develop more intensively in Western Sydney, we've always had sort of that soft landscaping of the quarter-acre block. Now that we're going to lose that, we need to be much more conscious about getting room for a tree canopy, because all we know, whatever anyone's views are on climate change, although I think the science is fairly straightforward there anyway, but whatever people's views are, the urban heat island effect is a known phenomenon. It has been for 40 years, and we need to counter that, because we know that the temperatures in Western Sydney can be 10 degrees higher than in the east, and that creates a real justice issue for people in the west and the people in the east, and so that tree canopy is absolutely imperative.
Let's stay there with the Greener Places policy again. This is a metropolitan policy for the Sydney area, but then our local government organisations, they simply do not have the money to really implement this really ambitious and incredible green grid that we've got planned for the metropolitan area of Sydney. So could we use some of the stimulus that's on offer now because of the COVID pandemic to actually help build these green areas and actually give some money to our local government organisations so that we can actually increase green space at the LGA level?
Sara, your point is absolutely right. What we need to do is, we know that in terms of stimulating the economy, ordinarily we've used interest rates as a lever to inspire housing development. Interest rates are at historic lows, there's no flexibility there. So the one thing that we do have in states like New South Wales, we've got a strong credit rating, so we've got capacity to borrow and service that debt. And so government-led infrastructure projects are crucial. And of course, the smaller scale government infrastructure projects are those that are quicker to get off the ground and can also inspire employment of a whole series of trades and artisans and those sorts of people at a local level. So that sort of stimulus we know is economically sensible. And that's why here in New South Wales, we've just announced a $250 million fund for local councils, where we've sort of said to them, well, we will provide $250 million toward public spaces, their acquisition and their beautification and their restoration, in return for you ensuring that your development approval systems are efficient and effective and up to date. And so that was a novel argument we were able to use with Treasury. Treasury want, big housing outcomes and development application outcomes, and we were able to say, well, let's incentivise councils to get us those efficient systems by putting $250 million on the table to realise the vision of Sydney's green grid.
So Minister, we can build green open spaces, but how do we know that they perform well? What are the metrics? How do we measure? How can we prove to you that our green open spaces are doing what they're doing and they're giving back social benefit, they're providing health outputs? What are the metrics that you need landscape architects to use?
Well, the first thing is we already know that green open spaces provide all sorts of great social benefits. I mean, the health outcomes are demonstrable, have been for many, many years, both for physical health and wellbeing, but also increasingly for mental health and wellbeing. The connection between provision of green open spaces and quality, safe open spaces, and the connection with mental health and wellbeing is also now well demonstrated with a very solid evidence base. But there are also, and then there are the economic productivity benefits of having a physically active population, the decrease for health budgets, all the rest. So the evidence is already in. What we do need is for governments to set some quantitative targets around what success looks like. And so in New South Wales, for example, the Premier's given me 2 direct targets. One is to ensure that we plant 5 million trees in Greater Sydney by 2030. So that's a pretty ambitious target.
Yes.
I have to report on how we're going with that. It is a quantitative target, so we've also got to look at qualitative measures to make sure they're planted in the right places and to make sure that money is there to ensure that they're not just planted but they thrive. Yes. The other thing, the other target that the Premier has given to me relates to ensuring that every Sydney-sider has access to safe, usable, accessible public open space within a 10-minute walk of their home over time. So a 10% increase over the next few years in the number of residents with access to public open spaces. So some quantitative measurable targets to drive government is the other key, and that's what we've got in New South Wales, and I'd encourage other jurisdictions to look at the same things.
I'm sure our members would be really open to providing that to ministers across the country to actually help install and prove, and continue to advocate for public open spaces and well-designed, as you've said, green open spaces. Minister, are there any last comments that you'd like to share with the membership, the broad membership of Australia, for all our Australian Institute of Landscape Architect members out there?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, first, what you do is truly important. You're building a legacy that people will benefit from in 10, 20, 30, 100 years' time. So the work you are doing is really important for the future of our society, and not just for the physical environment and for effectively a new Green Deal, to put it in the US terms of how we can combat climate change, yes, but also in terms of its capacity to make people's lives better. So the sort of human benefits of green open spaces and accessible open spaces. I guess my encouragement would be to think outside some of the ideologies that have shaped debates around public spaces. I think some of the cynicism toward some of the green agenda is when people feel that they're locked out of public spaces, which sort of sounds counterintuitive, the idea that you have a public space but then prevent people from being able to use it or access it. That can be problematic in terms of building a community consensus about the value of these spaces. Obviously there are wilderness spaces and so forth where we need to be careful about what we do in them, but we need to design places for people to be able to access them and also to think creatively. I think sometimes with uses that are transitory. So for example, where you have land that might be locked up for a future transport corridor or a future drainage corridor or something like that, we just lock it there and let the tumbleweed run and say, oh, we can't do anything with that land. But it may be 20, 30 years before it's used. It may never be used. Yeah. And that's generations of young people, of older people who could use that space right now. And there's a sort of searing injustice where people are locked off from their own land because of some future use that may or may not happen. We need to be much more tactical about how we use those spaces, but also much more creative about the spaces in between. Talked a little bit about the idea of margins, but sometimes public space places are forgotten. I mean, until the 1960s, this harbour, no one even noticed it was here. Buildings were built to look away from the harbour, and suddenly Sydney woke up and said, wow, look at that. I think we can go through the same process in our own neighbourhoods, our own backyards, our own industrial areas. Those riparian corridors or drainage easements or easements for power lines, all these sorts of places. Why can't we think more creatively about those? Some of the great canal routes in Sydney have now been reinvented. The Greenway, for example, in the inner west. We've got some incredible sort of drainage swales even that we could reinvent. Of course, we shouldn't just say, well, flood-prone land should be the only parkland, but equally, flood-prone land should be used for the public to be able to access it as well. We've got no shortage of land. Sometimes I think we've got so much of it we don't know where to start.
Yes.
And there have been some great examples where councils have actually sold off some public open space to ensure that they've had money to make sure the balance of it can be used much more effectively. Penrith Council recently won a significant Planning Institute award for doing just that. So for the Australian Institute of Landscape Architecture to look at inspiring innovation in those areas would be something I'd certainly recommend.
Minister, thank you so much today for your insights. We really look forward to watching you to continue to lead and really influence public open space here in New South Wales. And hopefully our members have been inspired today in their own jurisdictions to actually advocate for a Minister of Public Open Spaces. I'm going to ask you for a handshake on the elbow.
Thanks, Sara.
And wish you all the best. Thanks,
Thank you,
Minister.
you too.